The winter came early that year, hard and unforgiving, the kind of season that settled deep into the bones and refused to leave. The land around Draco's sheep ranch lay stripped and colorless beneath a sky the color of old tin. Frost clung to the ground, even at midday, and the wind moved across the open range with nothing to stop it, carrying dust, dry grass, and the faint, bitter smell of neglect. Draco stood at the edge of the corral, a bottle in his hand, watching the sheep nose at the frozen earth. There were fewer of them now. Too many had been sold off to pay debts that never seemed to shrink. And too many had died when he had simply stopped caring whether they lived or not. The ones that remained were thin, their ribs visible through dull, matted wool. They moved slowly, conserving what little strength they had left, as if they already knew that winter was not done with them. Once, this place had been something else. 5 years ago, Draco's ranch had stretched clean and orderly across the valley. The fences had stood straight. The barn doors hung square. And the sheep, hundreds of them, were well fed and healthy. Buyers had come from towns 40, even 50 miles away. Because Draco was known as a man who delivered good wool and honest weight. He had risen before dawn and worked until the light failed, coming home tired in a way that felt earned. But that was before his wife died. No one in the valley spoke of it anymore. Death was common out here: illness, accidents, weather, violence, but some losses carved deeper than others. Draco had stopped correcting people when they avoided the subject. He had stopped expecting anyone to understand what it felt like to wake up in a house that still held the shape of another person. But none of the warmth. The bottle tilted again. Whiskey burned down his throat. Sharp and familiar. It didn't take the pain away. Not really. It only dulled the edges enough that he could stand to breathe. Behind him, the ranch house loomed big, weathered, and tired. It was a place built for a family, not for a man living alone with his ghosts. The porch boards sagged under their own weight, and one shutter hung crooked, banging softly whenever the wind picked up. Inside, there were rooms Draco hadn't stepped into in months. He turned away from the sheep and walked toward the house, his boots crunching over the frozen dirt. Near the door, nailed crookedly into the wood, was the notice he had tried not to look at all morning. Foreclosure pending. 10 days. 10 days until Christmas. 10 days until the land his people had worked, the land his wife had loved, would belong to someone else. Draco tore the paper down and crumpled it in his fist. The sound of it ripping free felt louder than it should have, echoing across the empty yard. He didn't throw it away, though. He shoved it into his coat pocket like a thing that might follow him if he let it go. Inside, the house smelled of cold wood, old smoke, and stale liquor. He poured himself another drink without bothering to sit down. The table bore the scars of years' knife marks, burns, water stains, and a thin layer of dust he hadn't bothered to wipe away. Draco knew how he had ended up here. There was no mystery to it. He had stopped mending fences when they broke. He had stopped replacing boards when the barn roof started leaking. He had hired no hands after the last one quit. Unable to stomach working for a man who barely showed up. He had let the sheep wander too far, fed them too little, and sold the strongest ones first because they brought better money. Each decision had seemed small at the time, temporary, fixable later, but later had never come. That afternoon, as the light faded and the cold deepened, Draco sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper torn from an old ledger. The whiskey bottle stood nearby, already half empty. His hand shook slightly as he wrote. And not from the cold alone. The words came slowly. Land, shelter, a future. He stared at the line for a long time. It wasn't entirely a lie. The land existed. The house still stood. And some kind of future, however uncertain, remained. But he did not write about the debts. He did not write about the notice nailed to the door. He did not write about the way the ranch was already half dead. Draco folded the paper carefully, as if that might make the lie smaller, and stuffed it into his coat. He would ride into town tomorrow and post it. The idea of it made his stomach twist with something that felt like shame. But he pushed that aside. Shame was a luxury for men with options. Night settled in fast. The wind rose, rattling the windows, and Draco lay down fully dressed on the narrow bed, boots still on his feet. Sleep came unevenly, dragging him under in fits and starts. He dreamed of sheep moving endlessly across the hills, their backs white and full, their bells ringing faintly. When he woke, his mouth tasted of metal and regret. The next morning, he rode into town with his collar turned up against the cold. The streets were quiet, most folks staying inside to save warmth and energy. Draco tacked the advertisement to the board outside the general store. Beside notices for lost horses and odd jobs, he didn't linger to see who might read it. Days passed. The bottle emptied and refilled. Draco counted the nights by how many times he woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak around him. He told himself, no one would answer the ad. That would have been easier. On the 7th morning, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps crunching across the frozen yard. Draco stood in the doorway when she came into view. She was young, maybe mid-20s, dressed better than most women who passed through that part of the territory. Her coat was clean, her boots worn but cared for. She stopped at the edge of the yard and took in the ranch in silence. She looked at the sagging fence, the bare ground, the sheep huddled against the wind. Her gaze was sharp, assessing. She knocked once, firm and unhesitating. Draco opened the door and met her eyes. Up close, she smelled faintly of soap and winter air. Her expression held no softness, no warmth, only expectation. You, Draco? She asked. Yes, he said. She stepped past him without waiting to be invited, stamping the cold from her boots. Inside, her eyes moved quickly over the room. She took in the broken chair leg propped against the wall, the thin blanket folded on the couch, the empty space where something better should have been. So, she said, turning back to him, this is the future you promised. Draco swallowed. Outside, the wind howled across the dying land, and for the first time in years, he felt the full weight of what he had set in motion. Quinn stood just inside the doorway, her gloved hands resting on her hips, taking in the house as if it were a puzzle that refused to fit together. The place was large, larger than most ranch homes she'd seen, but it felt hollow, like something important had been carried off and never replaced. The walls bore the marks of age and neglect. A narrow crack ran along the ceiling, and one window pane had been patched with a piece of oiled cloth instead of glass. Draco cleared his throat. It's warmer inside, he said, as if warmth alone could make up for everything else. Quinn didn't answer. She stepped farther in, her boots leaving damp prints on the worn floorboards. Her eyes moved slowly now, less curious than calculating. She had worked in saloons long enough to know when a man was selling more than he had to offer. You said in your notice there was land, she said. Good land, there is. Draco replied, "A lot of it," she said, arching one eyebrow. "Doesn't look like it's been used much lately." "That's fair," he admitted. He nodded once, stiffly, and went to the stove. The fire was low, but he added a few pieces of wood and poured water into the kettle. His hands were steady enough, though the weight of her presence pressed against his back, harder than the winter wind outside. Quinn shrugged out of her coat and draped it over the back of a chair. The chair looked solid enough, but when she sat, one leg gave way with a sharp crack. She yelped as the seat dropped out from under her, sending her down onto the floor in an undignified sprawl. Draco rushed forward. "I'm sorry. Damn it. I didn't know." He helped her up, careful, but awkward, as if afraid to touch her too firmly. She brushed off her skirt, her cheeks flushed more with embarrassment than anger. "Guess it hasn't been used in a while," she said dryly. "Most things around here haven't," Draco admitted. The kettle began to hiss. He poured hot water into a chipped mug and handed it to her. "It'll take the cold out of you," he said. She accepted it, wrapping her hands around the cup. The steam fogged her face, softening her expression just a little. She took a cautious sip. "All right," Quinn said at last. "Let's not dance around it. You say you've got land, a ranch, a future, but what I see is a place that's barely standing." Draco leaned against the table, the old wood creaking under his weight. "Looks can be deceiving," she gave a short laugh. "That's what men usually say right before the truth comes out." Silence stretched between them. Outside, a sheep bleated weakly, the sound thin and tired. Quinn set the mug down. "Are you wealthy?" The question was blunt, but she didn't soften it. Draco hesitated, then nodded. She studied him, her gaze steady. "Then, where is it?" "It's not something I talk about," he said. "Not right away." Her eyes narrowed. "That's convenient. I've had people come around before," Draco said, weaving the lie tighter. "People who wanted what I had. I learned to be careful." "Is that so?" Quinn asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you don't have much left to lose." The words landed hard. Draco felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the urge to reach for the bottle that waited just out of sight. He forced himself to stay still. "I didn't lie in the notice," he said. "Not outright." Quinn stood and walked toward the window, peering out at the yard. The sheep clustered near the fence, their heads down. Beyond them, the land stretched flat and brown toward the distant hills. "You didn't tell the whole truth, either," she said. She turned back to him. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Perhaps she knew what half-truths looked like. She had built a life out of them. "I didn't come here for romance," Quinn said. "I came because I'm tired of pouring drinks for men who think a smile means I owe them something. I want a roof that's mine, and a life that doesn't depend on tips and luck." Draco nodded slowly. "I understand that. Do you?" she asked. "Because understanding costs something." She crossed the room and picked up her coat. Draco felt his chest tighten. "I'm not leaving," she said. Seeing his reaction, "Not yet." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "But I'm not marrying you tomorrow, either," Quinn continued. "If there's a future here, I want to see it with my own eyes. We live together for a while. We see how things stand. Then we decide." "You want to stay?" Draco asked. "I want to try," she corrected. "There's a difference." He nodded. It was more than he had hoped for. The first night passed quietly. Quinn took the smaller bedroom down the hall, and Draco lay awake long, after the lamp was blown out, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving through the house. It unsettled him, and yet, in a way he couldn't quite name, it steadied him all at once. In the days that followed, the house began to change in small ways. Quinn opened windows, letting cold air and light flush out the stagnation. She moved things not much, but enough that Draco noticed. A chair set upright, a shelf wiped clean. The place felt less like a tomb and more like something unfinished, but they were still strangers navigating the tight corners of a shared life. And there was friction. Quinn had a habit of leaving things where they fell, while Draco, despite his neglect of the big things, clung to a rigid sort of order. The kitchen became their first real battlefield. Quinn insisted on cooking, despite having no real skill for it. One evening, the smell of scorching grease filled the hallway. Draco rushed in to find Quinn standing amidst a cloud of smoke. The meat burned black, and the pan ruined. She looked at him, defenseless and frustrated. Draco didn't shout. He spent the next hour scrubbing the pan while she sat on the counter, legs swinging, offering unhelpful advice. "Don't you ever get tired of fixing things?" she asked him. "Only when they don't need breaking in the first place," he muttered. She laughed then, unbarred and genuine. "Then you should probably keep me out of here." It was a small moment, but it revealed a rusty gentleness in him that he had forgotten he possessed. He wasn't just the man with the bottle. He was a man who knew how to clean up a mess, even one he hadn't made. However, the ease of those evenings was fragile. Outside, the days shortened, and the wind sharpened. Christmas crept closer, quiet and inevitable. The land remained stubbornly barren, and the sheep grew no fatter. The notice in Draco's pocket, the one counting down the 10 days, stayed folded and heavy against his chest. As the deadline approached, Draco grew quiet. It wasn't the comfortable silence of shared meals by the stove. It was a stiffness that Quinn recognized too well. It was the posture of a man carrying something heavy and pretending it wasn't there. The numbers in his head, the days left, refused to soften. Quinn noticed the bottle first. It appeared on the table one evening without explanation, half full, the cork already loose. Draco poured himself a drink without looking at her. Then another. She didn't say anything at first. Quinn had spent years working in saloons. She knew that people who drank like that didn't need an audience. They needed distance. But the drinks kept coming. By the time the fire burned low, Draco's shoulders sagged. The careful control he'd been holding on to, slipping away. One swallow at a time. He laughed once, sharp and humorless, at something she hadn't said. "You don't have to do this," she told him quietly. He waved her off. Just one night. But it wasn't just one night. And it wasn't just a drink. When he finally tried to stand, his legs gave out beneath him. He caught himself on the table, knocking over a chair with a crash that echoed through the silent house. Quinn was on her feet instantly. Her irritation gave way to concern as she saw the vulnerability in his face. "Easy," she said, looping his arm over her shoulder. "You're done." Draco didn't argue. He leaned into her, heavier than he looked, the smell of whiskey clinging to him like a second skin. She guided him down the narrow hallway toward the bedroom. Every step, careful and deliberate. The house felt too quiet around them, as if it were holding its breath. Waiting for the other shoe to drop, she eased him onto the bed. Draco groaned softly but didn't wake. Quinn straightened. Looking down at him, he looked older in the dim light. Worn down by a fight she didn't fully understand. She reached to pull off his boots, then bent to adjust the pillow beneath his head, wanting to spare him the stiff neck he'd complain about in the morning. That was when her fingers brushed against something hard. Quinn froze. Slowly, she lifted the pillow. Beneath it lay a thin stack of papers, folded and creased from being handled too often. The edges were worn soft, the ink smudged in places. Quinn recognized the look of official documents instantly. She had seen enough of them in her life: leases, debts, contracts that changed hands without mercy. She unfolded the top page just enough to see the heading, Transfer of Property. Her chest tightened. She didn't need to read every line. The seals were there. The dates. The signatures. These were papers for the sale of the house, the land, the sheep ranch itself. All of it. And the date. 10 days. Less than that now. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. Draco slept on, his face drawn even in rest. One hand curled near the documents, as if he might wake and claim them back. So this was the secret. Not wealth, not land held in reserve. Just the certainty of loss. Pressed so close, he slept on it every night, unable to put it away. For a moment, anger flared in her, hot and sharp. He had lied. He had brought her here, to the middle of nowhere, promising a future when he didn't even own the roof over his head. But as she looked at him, the anger cooled into something heavier. She saw a man who was terrified, a man who had put out a hand for help because he was drowning, even if he had lied about being able to swim. Quinn folded the papers carefully and slid them back beneath the pillow. She didn't wake him. She didn't shout or cry. She simply sat there until the fire burned down and the room grew cold, watching the man who had lied to her sleep like someone who had already been defeated. Morning came pale and brittle. Draco awoke with a pounding head and a mouth full of regret. The light through the window felt too bright, the air too sharp. He pushed himself upright and winced. Memories of the night before surfacing in jagged fragments. Quinn's voice. The fall. The taste of whiskey. He found her in the kitchen. She stood at the table, her coat already on. The papers were laid out neatly in front of her. She didn't look up when he entered. The silence in the room was thicker than the cold. Draco stopped short. His eyes went to the papers, and he felt something inside him collapse. The game was up. The pretense was over. When were you going to tell me? She asked. The question was quiet. It didn't accuse. That made it worse. I was going to, he said, his voice raspy. When? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer that didn't sound like another lie. I didn't know how, he admitted. Every day I told myself. Tomorrow. Quinn finally looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It was hurt. And something else, disappointment. Deep and settled. You said you had land, she said. You said there was a future here. There was. Draco said. Once. He swallowed hard, the shame burning hot behind his eyes. And now? Now there's 10 days. Silence stretched between them, heavy as snow-laden air. Draco ran a hand through his hair. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bear to see the confirmation that he was exactly what he feared: a failure. If you want to leave, he said, forcing the words out. I won't stop you. I deserve that. Quinn studied him for a long moment. She thought of the cold nights behind the bar, of the men who smiled and took and left without ever looking back. She thought of the way this house, broken as it was, had begun to feel like something she could tend. She stepped closer to the table. "You didn't lie about being broken," she said finally. Draco looked up, startled. "You lied about money," Quinn continued. "About land, but not about who you are. I've seen worse lies told for less." She walked around the table until she stood directly in front of him. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, frightened beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I came here for a future," she said. "I didn't know what it would look like. Turns out, neither did you." Tears burned at the corners of Draco's eyes. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, and the sensation terrified him. "I don't want to lose this place," he whispered hoarsely. "Or you." "Then stop running," Quinn said. Her voice was firm now, stripping away the self-pity. "Stop sleeping on the truth like it won't crush you." He nodded once, sharp and decisive. They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, light spilling across the table, and the papers that had nearly ended them. Outside, the sheep stirred, unaware of how close everything had come to falling apart. Quinn reached for Draco's hand and squeezed it. "We've got work to do," she said, and for the first time since the notice had been nailed to his door, Draco believed her. They did not celebrate the decision. There was no sudden joy, no sweeping relief. The truth had been spoken, the lie laid bare. But the land did not care about honesty. The sheep were still thin. The debt still waited. Christmas was still coming, steady and indifferent. But as Draco looked at Quinn, standing in the pale morning light with her coat on and her jaw set, he realized something. They weren't saving the ranch for the bank anymore. They were saving it for them. They did not celebrate the decision. There was no sudden joy, no sweeping relief. The truth had been spoken, the lie laid bare. But the land did not care about honesty. The sheep were still thin. The debt still waited. Christmas was still coming, steady and indifferent. If they were going to save the ranch, it would not be with promises. It would be with work. Quinn was the one who spoke first, the morning after. Draco had expected anger, or distance, or the quiet packing of her things. Instead, she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and set one in front of him. "Like this was just another day. We sell what we have," she said. Draco frowned, looking into the black coffee. "There's not much left. There's enough," Quinn replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You've got sheep. That's meat and wool. The wool's poor quality," he said, the old shame rising again. "Too thin. Buyers won't touch it. They'll buy if it's clean and honest." Quinn cut in. "And if they don't? We find someone who will." He studied her face. There was no hesitation there, no doubt. Quinn had spent her life reading risk in men's eyes, calculating the odds of survival in rooms filled with smoke and bad intentions. This was different. This was a woman who had already decided to stay. "All right," Draco said. "We try." The work began that same morning. Draco took the shears down from the hook, where they had been hanging unused for too long. The metal was cold in his hand, heavy with memory. He chose the oldest sheep first, the ones whose coats had grown heavy and tangled, burdened by the same neglect that had choked the ranch. He worked slowly, careful not to cut the skin, the rhythm of the blade steady and deliberate. It was a motion his father had taught him, a muscle memory that had survived the grief and the whiskey. Wool fell away in thick clumps, piling at his feet. By midday, His hands were cramped and sore. But he didn't stop. Quinn worked beside him. She didn't know the trade. But she watched. And she learned. She sorted the wool, pulling out burrs and dirt, rolling the clean fleece into tight bundles. She moved with a surprising focus. Her earlier flirtation and saloon ease replaced by something quieter and more solid. There was a moment, late in that first afternoon, when Draco came around the corner of the barn to find Quinn crouched low, a pair of smaller shears in her hand. She was working on one of the older ewes herself. Her sleeves rolled up against the cold. The cut was rough, uneven, exposing the pale skin to the winter air. "What the hell are you doing?" Draco demanded, the instinct to protect his flock flaring up. Quinn looked up, startled, but defensive. "Relax. I didn't hurt her. You can't just go cutting into my flock," he said. "They need that wool." Her coat was matted so bad she could barely move. Quinn shot back. She stood, holding up a thick, tangled bundle of fleece. "And I needed this." Draco opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The sheep did look more comfortable, lighter on its feet. And Quinn looked determined. She disappeared into the house with the wool, and came back hours later. She was wearing a makeshift coat. It wasn't pretty. The stitching was uneven. The fit boxy, but it was thick. And it was warm. She turned in a slow circle, grinning at him. "Real wool," she said. "Better than anything I owned before." Draco stared at her, torn between irritation and reluctant amusement. "You can't just take things without asking," he grumbled. "You weren't using it," she replied simply. "And now you see what it can be." She was right. She was claiming the land, not by owning the deed, but by using what it offered. She wore that coat like armor, a signal that she was no longer just a visitor passing through. She was part of the operation, but wool alone wouldn't pay the debt in 10 days. They needed more. In the afternoons, the work turned harder, darker. Draco slaughtered the sheep, one at a time. It was a gruesome necessity, the kind of hard reality that stripped away any romance about ranching. But he did it cleanly, respectfully, the way he had been taught. There was no cruelty in it, only the ancient bargain between man and beast care. In exchange for sustenance, Quinn took the meat inside. The kitchen became a processing floor. She trimmed the cuts with care. Her hands that had poured drinks and dealt cards, learning the weight of a knife against bone. She salted the meat to preserve it, packed it in ice, and seasoned portions to test. That first evening, she handed him a plate. The kitchen was warm. The windows steamed up against the night. Draco tasted the meat and blinked. It was simple, but it was rich and flavorful. "That's good," he said. Surprised, she smiled faintly, wiping her hands on her apron. "People will pay for good." She didn't get it right every time. There was the day she burned a pan so badly the house filled with acrid smoke, forcing them to throw the doors open to the freezing wind. Draco had spent an hour scrubbing the scorched metal while she sat on the counter, swinging her legs and laughing at her own mistake. "You keep out of the cooking," he had muttered. But there was no venom in it. He cleaned the mess because she had spent the last 6 hours standing in the snow sorting fleece. It was a balance, a partnership forged in sweat and soot. As the days ground on, the routine settled in. Shearing, slaughtering, packing, selling. Draco worked until his muscles screamed, until his back locked up. But the ache felt different now. It wasn't the hollow, crushing weight of depression. It was the good, clean pain of effort. It was purposeful. And the house began to change around them. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It happened the way winter loosens its grip slowly, almost unwillingly. Quinn moved through the ranch house like someone testing the weight of things. She opened one window a day, letting the stale air of the last 5 years drift out into the valley. She wiped the dust from the shelves. She set a chair upright and fixed its wobble with a folded scrap of wood. Draco noticed the difference most in the mornings. The kettle was filled before he reached for it. The table had been cleared of yesterday's clutter. The air smelled faintly of soap instead of old smoke and sour liquor. It wasn't luxury. The walls were still cracked, the floor still worn, but it was order. And for a man who had felt his life spinning out of control, that order was a lifeline. He found himself breathing easier. Draco also found himself reaching for the bottle less often. He didn't make a grand declaration about it. He didn't pour the whiskey down the sink in a dramatic gesture of reform. He simply stopped picking it up. He would look at the amber liquid sitting on the shelf. And then he would look at Quinn, her head bent over a ledger, or her hands busy mending a burlap sack. He didn't want her to see him the way he had been. He didn't want to dull the edges anymore. He needed to be sharp. He needed to be ready. One night, after a long day of mending fences, Draco came into the house to find Quinn sitting at the table with his wife's old sewing kit open in front of her. He froze in the doorway. "I can put it away," she said quickly, seeing his expression. "No," Draco said after a moment. The tightness in his chest was there, but it was manageable. "It's fine." She ran a finger along the worn wood of the box. She was good with her hands. "Yes," he said. Quinn closed the kit gently. "You don't talk about her much." "I don't know how," he admitted. She nodded, accepting that, without pushing for more. "You don't have to." "Not yet." That night, when Draco lay in bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, he realized he hadn't thought about the foreclosure notice all day. The realization startled him. The danger hadn't passed. The land was still at risk. But the weight of it had shifted. It was shared now, in some quiet way he hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. Outside, the sheep moved softly in their pen. Inside, the fire crackled low in the stove. Draco listened to the sounds of the house, the wind rattling the pane, the soft footsteps of Quinn moving down the hall, and felt something unfamiliar take hold. It wasn't hope. Exactly. It was responsibility. It was the fragile sense that this place, this broken life, might still be worth tending. He rolled over and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, they would load the wagon. Tomorrow, they would see if the world still had a place for honest work. But for tonight, the house held them both. And that was enough. 2 days later, they loaded the wagon before dawn. The road into town stretched nearly 15 miles, a ribbon of frozen ruts that jarred the wheels with every turn. The sheep wool was stacked high in burlap sacks, rough and smelling of lanolin. The meat was packed in ice and wrapped tight. The horses breathed steam into the cold air, their pace steady. Draco sat with the reins in his hands, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside him, Quinn sat straight, her chin tucked into the collar of her coat. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say that the work hadn't already said. The fear was there, riding in the wagon bed with them. But it was quieter now. It was the fear of men and women who have done all they can and must simply wait to see if it is enough. The town market sat on the edge of the square, A rough collection of stalls and wagons. Farmers, ranchers, and miners, anyone with something to sell or trade, had gathered despite the biting cold. Quinn climbed down first. Her coat was pulled tight, but her eyes were already scanning the crowd. She took charge, without asking. Draco watched her set up the stall, arrange the cuts of meat neatly, and wipe her hands on her apron. She greeted people with a confidence that came from years of dealing with strangers in rooms full of noise and judgment. There were no false smiles, no begging. "Fresh lamb," she called out, her voice clear over the murmur of the crowd. "Ranch raised. Clean." A man stopped. Then another. The first sale came quick. Then the second. Quinn weighed each cut carefully, quoted fair prices, and made change without fumbling. She was in her element. She knew how to read a face, how to tell the difference between a looker and a buyer, how to close a deal with a nod and a look that said she respected their time. By noon, half the meat was gone. Draco stood nearby, handling the wool. Most people passed it by without stopping. He had expected that. It wasn't the fine, soft fleece of the wealthy herds further south. It was rough country wool. Then, a man with a long coat and sharp eyes paused. He reached down to lift one of the bundles. "Who sheared this?" the man asked. "I did," Draco said, bracing himself for a haggle. The man rubbed the wool between his fingers, testing the texture, looking for the grease and the dirt. "Not the best weight," the man said, "but it's honest. No rot. No shortcuts. I won't say otherwise," Draco replied. The man nodded once. "I buy for a mill out east. I'll take all of it." Draco's heart thudded hard in his chest. A heavy, frantic rhythm. All, the man confirmed. "And if you can bring me the same quality again, we'll talk about more." They shook hands. The man paid in cash. By the time the sun dipped low, casting long purple shadows across the snow, the wagon was nearly empty. Quinn counted the money twice, then a third time, her hands steady despite the cold. She looked up at Draco. "It's not everything," she said, "but it's a start." They made the trip again 2 days later. And again. The routine settled in shearing, slaughtering, packing, selling. Draco worked until his muscles screamed. But the ache felt different now. It felt purposeful. By the 8th day, they had enough to cover the worst of the debt. By the 9th, enough to breathe. The foreclosure notice stayed folded beneath the pillow. But it no longer felt like a death sentence. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky the color of iron. Draco awoke before dawn with a familiar ache in his shoulders and hands. But it no longer frightened him. Pain meant work had been done. They hitched the horses and headed toward town one last time. The road was quiet, the snow muffling the sound of the hooves, the sky wide and pale above them. Draco felt the weight of the past week settle into something steadier. Not just relief. Resolution. The bank stood as it always had. Square and unwelcoming. Draco and Quinn went in together. The clerk looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He recognized Draco. Everyone in the valley did. They knew the story of the grieving widower, the failing ranch. "You hear about the foreclosure?" the man asked. "Yes," Draco said. "I'm here to end it." They counted the money out on the desk. Bills worn soft from hands that had worked for them. Coins, cold and heavy. The clerk checked the ledger twice, then nodded. "That settles it," he said. "The land stays in your name." Draco exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized how tight his chest had been until that moment. It was as if a band of iron, rusted tight around his ribs for 5 long years, had finally snapped. Outside, the air was biting, but Draco didn't feel the cold. Quinn took his hand. "Well," she said, "guess we didn't lose everything." "No," Draco said, looking at her, really looking at her. "We didn't." They rode back through falling snow, the ranch coming into view like something reclaimed rather than rescued. When they reached the yard, Draco pulled the foreclosure notice from his coat pocket, the same one he had carried for weeks. The paper worn thin by his worry. He didn't burn it. He didn't crumble it. He tore it clean in half. He dropped the pieces into the snow and watched the wind scatter them across the frozen ground. The house felt warmer when they stepped inside. That evening, Quinn lit candles. Draco cooked not well, but with effort, and she let him, correcting him only when absolutely necessary. They ate together, laughing softly at the small mistakes. The burned edges, the over-salted potatoes. Later, they sat by the stove, the fire crackling low. The quiet between them was easy now. "I never asked," Draco said, "why you stayed." Quinn didn't answer right away. She watched the flames dance, their light reflecting in her eyes. "I came for money," she said finally. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I stayed because you didn't pretend to be someone else once the truth came out." He nodded. That felt right. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright. It was the kind of cold that sharpened the world instead of dulling it. The church was small, its windows glowing against the snow. A handful of people gathered: neighbors, townsfolk, men and women who had bought their meat and wool, who had watched them work. Quinn walked down the narrow aisle without fuss. There was no veil, no borrowed finery. She wore just her wool coat, the one she had made with her own hands, and she took steady steps. Draco waited at the front, his hands rough, his spine straight. When she reached him, she took his hand without hesitation. The ceremony was brief, honest. The words spoken were simple, the kind that mattered because they didn't promise what couldn't be kept. When it was done, the congregation smiled, nodded, and drifted out into the cold. Someone laughed. Someone clapped Draco on the shoulder. Outside, the snow caught the sunlight and held it. They returned to the ranch together, husband and wife, not because it had saved them, but because they had chosen it, and each other, with clear eyes. Life did not soften overnight. The fences still needed work. The barn roof still leaked when the snow melted too fast. Money came in steady, but not plenty. Some nights, Draco lay awake listening to the wind. The old fear, stirring faintly, but it no longer ruled him. By spring, new lambs were born. Quinn kept the books. Draco kept the land. They argued sometimes about money, about work, about when to rest. But they did not turn away from each other. When things grew hard, one evening, months later, they stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink low over the valley. The sheep grazed, healthy and whole. "This place nearly broke you," Quinn said. "It did," Draco replied. "Then it taught me how to stay." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. They did not speak of forever. They spoke of tomorrow, of fences to mend, of wool to shear, of supper waiting inside. And that was enough, because happiness, Draco had learned, was not loud. It didn't arrive like a miracle. It came quietly, when two people chose not to run and built something that could hold. Thank you for spending this time with Draco and Quinn, and for walking with them through loss, work, and redemption. I'd love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Did Quinn make the right choice, staying? Or maybe you have a story of your own about a hard winter that turned into a new beginning? Please, share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And let me know where you're listening from today. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If this story spoke to you, please hit subscribe, like, and share it with a friend who might need a reminder that it's never too late to start over. Until next time, this is Echoes of the West. Stay safe out there.